Okay. Welcome, everybody, including those on Facebook Live. Today, we're going to continue with our reading of Dubliners, and the story in question is going to be the penultimate story in the book called Grace. And off we go. Two gentlemen who were in the lavatory at the time tried to lift him up, but he was quite helpless. He laid curled up at the foot of the stairs down which he had fallen. They succeeded in turning him over. His hat had rolled a few yards away, and his clothes were smeared with the filth and ooze of the floor on which he had lain, face downward. His eyes were closed, and he breathed with a grunting noise. A thin stream of blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. These two gentlemen and one of the curates carried him up the stairs and laid him down again on the floor of the bar. In 2 minutes, he was surrounded by a ring of men. The manager of the bar asked everyone who he was and who was with him. No one knew who he was, but one of the curates said he had served the gentleman with a small rum. Was he by himself? Asked the manager. No, sir, there were 2 gentlemen with him. And where are they? No one knew. A voice said, "Give him air. He's fainted." Next, please.
The ring of onlookers distended and closed again elastically. A dark metal of blood had formed itself near the man's head on the tessellated floor. The manager, alarmed by the gray pallor of the man's face, sent for a policeman. His collar was unfastened and his necktie undone. He opened his eyes for an instant, sighed, and closed them again. One of the gentlemen who had carried him upstairs held a dinged silk hat in his hand. The manager asked repeatedly, did no one know who the injured man was, or where had his friends gone? The door of the bar opened and an immense constable entered. A crowd which had followed him down the laneway collected outside the door, struggling to look in through the glass panels. The manager at once began to narrate what he knew. The constable, a young man with thick, immobile features, listened. He moved his head slowly to right and left, and from the manager to the person on the floor, as if he feared to be the victim of some delusion. Then he drew off his gloves, produced a small book from his waist, licked the lead of his pencil, and made ready to indict. He asked in a suspicious provincial accent, "Who is the man? What's his name and address?" Joe.
A young man in a cycling suit cleared his way through the ring of the bystanders. He knelt down promptly beside the injured man and called for water. The constable knelt down also to help. The young man washed the blood from the injured man's mouth and then called for some brandy. Constable repeated the order in an authoritative voice until a curate came running with the glass. The brandy was forced down the man's throat. In a few seconds, he opened his eyes and looked about him. He looked at the circle of faces and then, understanding, strove to rise to his feet. You're all right now?" asked the young man in the cycling suit. Said the injuring man, trying to stand up. He was helped to his feet. The manager said something about a hospital, and some of the bystanders gave advice. The battered silk hat was placed on the man's head. The constable asked, "Where do you live?" The man, without answering, began to twirl the ends of his moustache. He made light of his accident. It was nothing. He said, "Oh, only a little accident." He spoke very thickly. Tom?
"Where do you live?" repeated the constable. The man said they were to get a cab for him. While the point was being debated, a tall, agile gentleman of fair complexion, wearing a long yellow ulster, came from the far end of the bar. Seeing the spectacle, he called out, "Hello, Tom, old man, what's the trouble?" "That's nothing," said the man. The newcomer surveyed the deplorable figure before him and then turned to the constable, saying, "It's all right, constable, I'll see him home." The constable touched his helmet and answered, "All right, Mr. Power." "Come now, Tom," said Mr. Power, taking his friend by the arm. "No bones broken. What? Can you walk?" The young man in the cycling suit took the man by the other arm, and the crowd divided. "How did you get yourself into this mess?" asked Mr. Power. "The gentleman fell down the stairs," said the young man. "I very much oblige to you, sir," said the injured man. "Not at all. Can't we have a little—" "Not now, not now." The three men left the bar, and the crowd sifted through the doors to the laneway. The manager brought the constable to the stairs to inspect the scene of the accident. They agreed that the gentleman must have missed his footing. The customers returned to the counter, and the curate set about removing the traces of blood from the floor. Next.
Okay. When they came out into Grafton Street, Mr. Power whistled for an outsider. The injured man said again, as well as he could, "Cheers, sir. I hope we'll meet again." "Yeah, no, it's Kiernan." The shock and the insipid pain had partly sobered him. "Don't mention it," said the young man. They shook hands. Mr. Kiernan was hoisted on, and while Mr. Power was giving directions to the carman, he expressed his gratitude to the young man and regretted that they could not have a little drink together. "Another time," said the young man. The car drove off towards Westmoreland Street, and as it passed the ballast office, the clock showed 9:30. A keen east wind hit them, blowing from the mouth of the river. Mr. Kiernan was huddled together with cold. His friend asked him to tell how the accident had happened. And he answered, and is hurt. Sure. The other leaned over the well of the car and peered into Mr. Kiernan's mouth, but he could not see. He struck a match and sheltered it in the shell of his hands, peered again into the mouth, which Mr. Kiernan opened obediently. The swaying movement of the car brought the match to and from the opened mouth. The lower teeth and gums were covered with clotted blood, and a minute piece of the tongue seemed to have been bitten off. The match was blown out. That's ugly. Next, please.
"That is nothing," said Mr. Kernan, closing his mouth and pulling the collar of his filthy coat across his neck. Mr. Kernan was a commercial traveller of the old school, which believed in the dignity of its calling. He had never been seen in the city without a silk hat of some decency and a pair of gaiters. By grace of these two articles of clothing, he said, a man could always pass muster. He carried on the tradition of his Napoleon, the great Black White, whose memory he evoked at times by legend and mimicry. Modern business methods had spared him only so far as to allow him a little office in Crow Street, on the window blind of which was written the name of his firm with the address London EC. On the mantelpiece of his little office, a little leaden battalion of canisters was drawn up, and on the table before the window stood 4 or 5 china bowls, which were usually half full of black liquid. From these bowls, Mr. Kernan tasted tea. He took a mouthful, drew it up, saturated his palate with it, and then spat it forth into the grate. Then he paused to judge. Mr. Power, a much younger man, was employed in the Royal Irish Constabulary Office at Dublin Castle. The arc of his social rise intersected the arc of his friend's decline, but Mr. Kernan's decline was mitigated by the fact that certain of those friends who had known him at his highest point of success still esteemed him as a character. Mr. Power was one of these friends. His inexplicable deaths were a byword in his circle. He was a debonair young man. Next, please.
The car halted before a small house on the Glasnevin Road, and Mr. Kiernan was helped into the house. His wife put him to bed while Mr. Power sat downstairs in the kitchen, asking the children where they went to school and what book they were in. The children, 2 girls and a boy, conscious of their father's helplessness and of their mother's absence, began some horseplay with him. He was surprised at their manners and at their accents, and his brow grew thoughtful. After a while, Mrs. Kiernan entered the kitchen, exclaiming, "Oh, such a sight! Oh, he'll do for himself one day, and that's the holy alls of it. He's been drinking since Friday." Mr. Power was careful to explain to her that he was not responsible, that he'd come on the scene by the merest accident. Mrs. Kiernan, remembering Mr. Power's good offices during domestic quarrels as well as many small but opportune loans, said, "Oh, you needn't tell me that, Mr. Power. I know you're a friend of his, not like some of those others he does be with. They're all right so long as he has money in his pocket to keep him out from his wife and family. Nice friends. Who is he with tonight, I'd like to know?" Mr. Power shook his head and said nothing. "I'm so sorry," she continued, "that I've nothing in the house to offer you. But if you'll wait a minute, I'll send round to Fogarty's at the corner." Mr. Power stood up. "We were waiting for him to come home with all the money. He never seems to think he has a home at all." "Oh, now, Mrs. Kiernan," said Mr. Power, "we'll make him turn over a new leaf. I'll talk to Martin. He's the man. We'll come here one of these nights and talk it over." She saw him to the door. The carman was stamping up and down the footpath and swinging his arms to warm himself. "It's very kind of you to bring him home," she said. "Not at all," said Mr. Power. He got up on the car. As it drove off, he raised his hat to her gaily. "We'll make a new man out of him," he said. "Good night, Mrs. Kiernan." Bill?
Mrs. Kernan's puzzled eyes watched the car till it was out of sight. Then she withdrew them, went into the house, and emptied her husband's pockets. She was an active, practical woman of middle age. Not long before, she had celebrated her silver wedding and renewed her intimacy with her husband by waltzing with him to Mr. Power's accompaniment. In her days of courtship, Mr. Kernan had seemed to her a not ungallant figure, and she still hurried to the chapel door whenever a wedding was reported, and seeing the bridal pair, recalled with vivid pleasure how she had passed out of the Star of the Sea Church in Sandymount, leaning on the arm of a jovial, well-fed man who was dressed smartly in a frock coat and lavender trousers, and carried a silk hat gracefully balanced upon his other arm. After 3 weeks, she had found a wife's life irksome, and later on, when she was beginning to find it unbearable, she had become a mother. The part of mother presented to her no insuperable difficulties, and for 25 years she had kept house shrewdly for her husband. Her 2 eldest sons were launched. One was in a draper's shop in Glasgow, and the other was clerk to a tea merchant in Belfast. They were good sons, wrote regularly, and sometimes sent home money. The other children were still at school. Mr. Kernan sent a letter to his office next day and remained in bed. She made beef tea for him and scolded him roundly. She accepted his frequent intemperance as part of the climate, healed him dutifully whenever he was sick, and always tried to make him eat a breakfast. There were worse husbands. He had never been violent since the boys had grown up, and she knew that he would walk on the end of Thomas Street and back again to book even a small order. 2 nights after his friends came to see him, she brought them up to his bedroom, the air of which was impregnated with a personal odor, and gave them
I have to check the door. So continue on, but I have to go out just for a second.
And gave them chairs at the fire. Mr. Kernan's tongue, the occasional stinging pain of which had made him somewhat irritable during the day, became more polite. He sat propped up in the bed by pillows, and the little color in the puffy cheeks made them resemble warm cinders. He apologized to his guests for the disorder of the room, but at the same time looked at them a little proudly, with a veteran's pride. Next.
He was quite unconscious that he was the victim of a plot which his friends, Mr. Cunningham, Mr. McCoy, and Mr. Power had disclosed to Mrs. Kernan in the parlor. The idea had been Mr. Power's, but its development was entrusted to Mr. Cunningham. Mr. Kernan came of Protestant stock, and though he had been converted to a Catholic faith at the time of his marriage, he had not been in the pale of the church for 20 years. He was fond, moreover, of giving side thrusts at Catholicism. Mr. Cunningham was a very man for such a case. He was an elder colleague of Mr. Power. His own domestic life was not very happy. People had great sympathy with him, for it was known that he had married an unpresentable woman who was an incurable drunkard. He had set up house for her 6 times, and each time she had pawned the furniture on him. Everyone had respect for poor Martin Cunningham. He was a thoroughly sensible man, influential and intelligent. His blade of human knowledge, natural astuteness, particularized by long association with cases in the police courts, had been tempered by a brief immersion in the waters of general philosophy. He was well informed. His friends bowed to his opinion and considered that his face was like Shakespeare's. Next, please. Duncan.
The next reader, please. I have to find out where we are.
When the plot had been disclosed to her, Mrs. Kiernan had said, "I leave it all in your hands, Mr. Cunningham." After a quarter century of married life, she had very few illusions left. Religion for her was a habit, and she suspected that a man of her husband's age would not change greatly before death. She was tempted to see a curious appropriateness in his accident, but that she did not wish to seem bloody-minded, she would have told the gentleman that Mr. Kiernan's tongue would not suffer by being shortened. However, Mr. Cunningham was a capable man, and religion was religion. The scheme might do good, and at least it could do no harm. Her beliefs were not extravagant. She believed steadily in the Sacred Heart as the most generally useful of all Catholic devotions, and approved of the sacraments. Her faith was bounded by her kitchen, but if she was put to it, she could believe also in the Banshee and in the Holy Ghost. Tom?
Duncan, do you want to come in there? No. The gentleman began to talk of the accident. Mr. Cunningham said that he had once known a similar case. A man of 70 had bitten off a piece of his tongue during an epileptic fit. The tongue had filled in again so that no one could see a trace of the bite. "Well, I'm not 70, said the invalid. "God forbid," said Mr. Cunningham. "It doesn't pain you now?" asked Mr. McCoy. Mr. McCoy had been at one time a tenor of some reputation. His wife, who had been a soprano, still taught young children to play the piano at low terms. His line of life had not been the shortest distance between 2 points, and for short periods he had been driven to live by his wits. He had been a clerk in the Midland Railway, a canvasser for advertisements for the Irish Times and for the Freeman's Journal, a town traveller for a coal firm on commission, a private inquiry agent, a clerk in the office of the sub-sheriff, and he had recently become secretary to the city coroner. His new office made him professionally interested in Mr. Kiernan's case. "Pain, not much," answered Mr. Kiernan, "but it's so sickening. I feel as if I wanted to retch off." "That's the booze," said Mr. Cunningham firmly. "No," said Mr. Kiernan, "I think I caught a cold in the car. There's something keeps coming into my throat, phlegm or mucus," said Mr. McCoy. "It keeps coming like from down in my throat, sickening thing." Yes, said Mr. McCoy, "that's the thorax." He looked at Mr. Cunningham and Mr. Power at the same time with an air of challenge. Mr. Cunningham nodded his head rapidly, and Mr. Power said, "Ah, well, all's well that ends well." "I'm very much obliged to you, old man," said the invalid. Mr. Power waved his hand. "Those other 2 fellows I was with." "Who were you with?" asked Mr. Cunningham. "A chap, I don't know his name. Damn it now, what's his name?" The little chap with sandy hair. And who else? Hartford. Said Mr. Cunningham. Next.
When Mr. Cunningham made that remark, people were silent. It was known that the speaker had secret sources of information. In this case, the monosyllable had a moral intention. Mr. Harford sometimes formed one of little detachment which left the city shortly after noon on Sunday, with the purpose of arriving as soon as possible at some public house on the outskirts of the city, where its members duly qualified themselves as bona fide travellers. But his fellow travellers had never consented to overlook his origin. He had begun life as an obscure financier by lending small sums of money to workmen at usurious interest. Later on, he had become the partner of a very fat, short gentleman, Mr. Goldberg, in the Liffey Loan Bank. Though he had never embraced more than the Jewish ethical code, his fellow Catholics, whenever they had smarted in person or by proxy under his exactions, spoke of him bitterly as an Irish Jew, an illiterate and so divined approval of usury made manifest through the person of his idiot son. At other times they remembered his good points. I wonder where did he go to, said Mr. Kiernan. He wished the details of the incident to remain vague. He wished his friends to think that there had been some mistake, that Mr. Hartford and he had missed each other. His friends, who knew quite well Mr. Hartford's manners and drinking, were silent. Mr. Power said again, "All's well that ends well." Mr. Kiernan changed the subject at once. Next, please.
Was a decent young chap, that medical fellow, he said. Only for him. Oh, only for him, said Mr. Power. It might have been a case of 7 days without the option of a fine. Yes, yes, said Mr. Kernan, trying to remember. I remember now there was a policeman. Decent young fellow, it seemed. How did it happen at all? It happened that you were polluted, Tom, said Mr. Cunningham gravely. True, Bill, said Mr. Kernan, equally gravely. I suppose you squared the constable, Jack, said Mr. McCoy. Mr. Power did not relish the use of his Christian name. He was not straight-laced, but he could not forget that Mr. McCoy had recently made a crusade in search of valises and portmanteaus to enable Mrs. McCoy to fulfill imaginary engagements in the country. More than he resented the fact that he had been victimized, he resented such low playing of the game. He answered the question, therefore, as if Mr. Kernan had asked it. The narrative made Mr. Kernan indignant. He was keenly conscious of his citizenship, wished to live with his city on terms mutually honourable, and resented any affront put upon him by those whom he called country bumpkins. Is this what we pay our rates for, he asked, to feed and clothe these ignorant bosthoons, and they're nothing else? Mr. Cunningham laughed. He was a castle official only during office hours. How could they be anything else, Tom, he said. He assumed a thick provincial accent and said in a tone of command, 65, watch your cabbage. Everyone laughed. Mr. McCoy, who wanted to enter the conversation by any door, pretended that he had never heard the story. Mr. Cunningham said, it is supposed, they say, to take place in the depot where they get these thundering big country fellows, Hamadans, to drill. The sergeant makes them stand in a row against the wall and held up their plates. Next, please.
He illustrated by grotesque gestures. At dinner, then he has a bloody big bowl of cabbage before him on the table and a bloody big spoon like a shovel. He takes up a wad of cabbage on the spoon and pegs it across the room, and the poor devils have to try to catch it on their plates. 65, catch your cabbage. Everyone laughed again. But Mr. Kiernan was somewhat indignant still. He talked of writing a letter to the papers. Oh, these yahoos coming up here, he said, think they can boss the people. I needn't tell you, Martin, what kind of men they are. Mr. Cunningham gave a qualified assent. It's like everything else in this world, he said. You get some bad ones and you get some good ones. Oh, yes, you get some good ones, I admit, said Mr. Kernan, satisfied. It's better to have nothing to say to them, said Mr. McCoy. That's my opinion. Mrs. Kiernan entered the room and, placing a tray on the table, said, Help yourselves, gentlemen. Mr. Power stood up to officiate, offering her his chair. She declined it, saying that she was ironing downstairs, and after having exchanged a nod with Mr. Cunningham behind Mr. Power's back, prepared to leave the room. Her husband called out to her, Have you nothing for me, ducky? Oh, you? The back of my hand to you, said Mrs. Kiernan tartly. Her husband called after her, Nothing for poor little hubby? He assumed such a comical face and voice that the distribution of bottles of stout took place amid general merriment. Gentlemen drank from their glasses, set the glasses again on the table, and paused. Then Mr. Cunningham turned toward Mr. Power and said casually, On Thursday night, you said, Jack? Thursday, yes, said Mr. Power. Right-o, said Mr. Cunningham promptly. We can meet at Macaulay's, said Mr. McCoy. That'll be the most convenient place. But we mustn't be late, said Mr. Power earnestly, because it's sure to be crammed to the doors. We can meet at 7:30, said Mr. McCoy. Right-o, said Mr. Cunningham. 7:30 at Macaulay's, be it. There was a short silence. Mr. Kiernan waited to see whether he would be taken into his friend's confidence. Then he asked, What's in the wind? Oh, it's nothing, said Mr. Cunningham. It's only a little matter that we're arranging about for Thursday. The opera, is it? Said Mr. Kiernan. No, said Mr. Cunningham in an evasive tone. It's just a little spiritual matter. Oh, said Mr. Kiernan. There was silence again. Then Mr. Power said point blank, To tell you the truth, Tom, we're going to make a retreat. I don't know. It goes to Bill. I'm not sure if he's here, so maybe Duncan, you could.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, Bill, sorry.
Bill's here.
Bill's here. Your square has moved. Sorry, Bill.
Yes, that's it, said Mr. Cunningham. Jack and I and McCoy here, we're all going to wash the pot. He uttered the metaphor with a certain homely energy and, encouraged by his own voice, proceeded, You see, we may as well all admit we're a nice collection of scoundrels, one and all. I say one and all, he added with gruff charity, and turning to Mr. Power. Own up now. I own up, said Mr. Power. And I own up, said Mr. McCoy. So we're going to wash the pot together, said Mr. Cunningham. A thought seemed to strike him. He turned suddenly to the invalid and said, Do you know what, Tom? Has just occurred to me. You might join in and we'd have a four-handed reel. Good idea, said Mr. Power, the four of us together. Mr. Kiernan was silent. The proposal conveyed very little meaning to his mind, but understanding that some spiritual agencies were about to concern themselves on his behalf, he thought he owed it to his dignity to show a stiff neck. He took no part in the conversation for a long while, but listened with an air of calm enmity while his friends discussed the Jesuits. I haven't such a bad opinion of the Jesuits, he said, intervening at length. They're an educated order. I believe they mean well, too. They're the grandest order in the church, Tom, said Mr. Cunningham with enthusiasm. The general of the Jesuits stands next to the Pope. There's no mistake about it, said McCoy. If you want a thing well done, and no flies about as you go to a Jesuit, there the boyos have influence. I'll tell you a case in point. The Jesuits are a fine body of men, said Mr. Power. It's a curious thing, said Mr. Cunningham, about the Jesuit order. Every other order of the church had to be reformed at some time or other, but the Jesuit order was never once reformed. It never fell away. Is that so? Asked Mr. McCoy. That's a fact, said Mr. Cunningham. That's history. Look at their church, too, said Mr. Power. Look at the congregation they have. The Jesuits cater for the upper classes, said Mr. McCoy. Of course, said Mr. Power. Yes, said Mr. Kiernan. That's why I have a feeling for them. It's some of those secular priests, ignorant, bumptious. They're all good men, said Mr. Cunningham, each in his own way. The Irish priesthood is honored all the world over. Oh, yes, said Mrs. Power. Not like some of the other priesthoods on the continent, said Mr. McCoy, unworthy of the name. Perhaps you're right, said Mr. Kiernan, relenting. course I'm right, said Mr. Cunningham. I haven't been in the world all this time and seen most of it without being a judge of character. Next, please.
The gentleman drank again, one following another's example. Mr. Kernan seemed to be weighing something in his mind. He was impressed. He had a high opinion of Mr. Cunningham as a judge of character and as a reader of faces. He asked for particulars. "Oh, it's just a retreat, you know," said Mr. Cunningham. "Father Purdon is giving it. It's for businessmen, you know." "He won't be too hard on us, Tom," said Mr. Power persuasively. "Father Purdon? Father Purdon?" said the invalid. "Oh, you must know him, Tom," said Mr. Cunningham stoutly. "Fine, jolly fellow. He's a man of the world like ourselves." Yeah, I think I know him. Rather red face, tall." "That's the man. And tell me, Martin, is he a good preacher?" It's not exactly a sermon, you know. It's just kind of a friendly talk, you know, in a common sense way." Mr. Kernan deliberated. Mr. McCoy said, "Father Tom Burke, that was the boy." "Oh, Father Tom Burke," said Mr. Cunningham, "that was a born orator. Did you ever hear him, Tom?" Next, please.
"Did I ever hear him?" said the invalid, nettled. "Rather. I heard him, and yet they say he wasn't much of a theologian," said Mr. Cunningham. "Is that so?" said Mr. McCoy. "Oh, of course, nothing wrong, you know. Only sometimes they say he didn't preach what was quite orthodox." "Ah, he was a splendid man," said Mr. McCoy. "I heard him once," Mr. Kernan continued. "I forget the subject of his discourse now. Crofton and I were in the back of the pit, you know, the bodies," said Mr. Cunningham. "Yes, in the back near the door. I forget now what. Oh, yes, it was on the Pope, the late Pope. I remember it well. Upon my word, it was magnificent, the style of the oratory. And his voice, God, hadn't he a voice? The prisoner of the Vatican, he called him. I remember Crofton saying to me when we came out, 'But he's an Orangeman, Crofton, isn't he?' said Mr. Power. 'Of course he is,' said Mr. Kernan, 'and a damn decent Orangeman, too. We went to Butler's in Moore Street. Faith, I was genuinely moved, tell you the God's truth, and I remember well his very words. Kernan, he said, we worship at different altars, he said, but our belief is the same. Struck me as very well put. There's a good deal in that, said Mr. Power. There used always be crowds of Protestants in the chapel when Father Tom was preaching. There's not much difference between us, said Mr. McCoy. We both believe in, he hesitated for a moment. Joe.
In the Redeemer. Only they don't believe in the Pope and in the Mother of God. But of course, said Mr. Cunningham quietly and effectively, our religion is the religion, the old original faith. Not a doubt of it, said Mr. Kernan warmly. Mrs. Kernan came to the door of the bedroom and announced, "Here's a visitor for you." "Who is it?" "Mr. Fogarty." "Oh, come in, come in." A pale oval face came forward into the light. The arch of its fair trailing moustache was repeated in the fair eyebrows looped above pleasantly astonished eyes. Mr. Fogarty was a modest grocer. He had failed in business in a licensed house in the city because his financial condition had constrained him to tie himself to second-class distillers and brewers. He had opened a small shop on Glasnevin Road where he flattered himself his manners would ingratiate himself with the housewives of the district. He bore himself with a certain grace, complimented little children, and spoke with a neat enunciation. He was not without culture. Mr. Fogarty brought a gift with him, a half-pint of special whisky. He inquired politely for Mr. Kernan, placed his gift on the table, and sat down with the company on equal terms. Mr. Kernan appreciated the gift all the more since he was aware that there was a small account for groceries unsettled between him and Mr. Fogarty, he said, "I wouldn't doubt you, old man. Open that jack, will you?" Tom?
Mr. Power again officiated. Glasses were rinsed and 5 small measures of whisky were poured out. The new influence enlivened the conversation. Mr. Fogarty, sitting on a small area of the chair, was specially interested. Pope Leo XIII, said Mr. Cunningham, was one of the lights of his age. His great idea, you know, was the union of the Latin and the Greek churches. That was the aim of his life. I often heard he was one of the most intellectual men in Europe, said Mr. Power. I mean, apart from his being Pope. So he was, said Mr. Cunningham, if not the most so. His motto, you know, as Pope was lux upon lux, light upon light. No, said Mr. Fogarty eagerly. I think you're wrong there. It was lux in tenebris, I think, light in darkness. Oh, yes, said Mr. Mackay, tenebrae. Allow me, said Mr. Cunningham positively. It was lux upon lux. And Pius IX's predecessor motto was crux upon crux. That is, cross upon cross, to show the difference between their two pontificates. The inference was allowed. Mr. Cunningham continued. Pope Leo, you know, was a great scholar and a poet. He had a strong face, said Mr. Kiernan. Yes, said Mr. Cunningham, he wrote Latin poetry. Is that so, said Mr. Fogarty. Mr. McCoy tasted his whisky contentedly and shook his head with a double intention, saying, that's no joke, I can tell you. We didn't learn that, Tom, said Mr. Power, following Mr. McCoy's example, when we went to the penny a week school. There was many a good man went to the penny a week school with a sod of turf under his oxter, said Mr. Kiernan sententiously. The old system was the best, plain, honest education, none of your modern trumpery. Quite right, said Mr. Power. No superfluities, said Mr. Fogarty. He enunciated the word, and then drank gravely. Next.
I remember reading, said Mr. Cunningham, that one of Pope Leo's poems was on the invention of the photograph in Latin, of course. On the photograph, exclaimed Mr. Kiernan. Yes, said Mr. Cunningham. He also drank from his glass. Well, you know, said Mr. McCoy, isn't the photograph wonderful when you come to think of it? Oh, of course, said Mr. Power. Great minds can see things. As the poet says, great minds are very near to madness, said Mr. Fogarty. Mr. Kiernan seemed to be troubled in mind. He made an effort to recall the Protestant theology on some thorny points, and in the end addressed Mr. Cunningham. Tell me, Martin, he said, well, some of the popes, of course, not our present man or his predecessor, but some of the old popes, not exactly, you know, up to the knob. There was a silence. Mr. Cunningham said, oh, of course, there were some bad lots, but the astonishing thing is this, not one of them, not the biggest drunkard, not the most out-and-out ruffian, not one of them ever preached ex cathedra a word of false doctrine. Now, isn't that an astonishing thing? Now, next, please.
That is, said Mr. Kiernan. Yes, because when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, Mr. Fogarty explained he is infallible. Yes, said Mr. Cunningham. Oh, I know about the infallibility of the Pope. I remember I was younger then. Or was it that? Mr. Fogarty interrupted. He took up the bottle and helped the others to a little more. Mr. McCoy, seeing that there was not enough to go around, pleaded that he had not finished his first measure. The others accepted under protest. The light music of whisky falling into glasses made an agreeable interlude. What's that you were saying, Tom? Asked Mr. McCoy. Papal infallibility, said Mr. Cunningham. That was the greatest scene in the whole history of the church. How was that, Martin? Asked Mr. Power. Mr. Cunningham held up 2 fingers. In the sacred college, you know, of cardinals and archbishops and bishops, there were 2 men who held out against it while the others were all for it. The whole conclave except these 2 was unanimous. No, they wouldn't have it. Ha, said Mr. McCoy. and they were a German cardinal by the name of Dowling, or Dowling was no German, and that's a sure five, said Mr. Power, laughing. Well, this great German cardinal, whatever his name was one, and the other was John McHale. What? Cried Mr. Kernan. Is that John of Tuam? Are you sure of that now? Asked Mr. Fogarty dubiously. I thought it was some Italian or American. John of Tuam, repeated Mr. Cunningham, was the man. He drank, and the other gentlemen followed his lead. Then he resumed. There they were at it, all the cardinals and bishops and archbishops from all ends of the earth, and these two fighting dog and devil until at last the Pope himself stood up and declared infallibility a dogma of the Church ex cathedra. On the very moment, John McHale, who had been arguing against it, stood up and shouted out with the voice of a lion, Credo! I believe, said Mr. Fogarty. Credo, said Mr. Cunningham. That showed the faith he had. He submitted the moment the Pope spoke. And what about Dowling? Asked Mr. McCoy. The German cardinal wouldn't submit, left the church. Mr. Cunningham's words had built up the vast image of the church in the mind of his hearers. His deep, raucous voice had thrilled them as it uttered the word of belief and submission. When Mrs. Kernan came into the room, drying her hands, she came into a solemn company. She did not disturb the silence, but leaned over the rail at the foot of the bed. Next, please.
I once saw John McHale, said Mr. Kiernan, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. He turned toward his wife to be confirmed. I often told you that? Mrs. Kiernan nodded. It was at the unveiling of Sir John Grey's statue. Edmund Dwyer Grey was speaking, blathering away, and there was this old fellow, crab-looking old chap, looking at him from under his bushy eyebrows. Mr. Kiernan knitted his eyebrows and, lowering his head like an angry bull, glared at his wife. God, he exclaimed, resuming his natural face. I never saw such an eye in a man's head. It was as much as to say, I have you properly taped, my lad. He had an eye like a hawk. None of the Greys was any good, said Mr. Power. So pause again. Mr. Power turned to Mrs. Kiernan and said with abrupt joviality, Well, Mrs. Kiernan, we're going to make your man here a good, holy, pious, and God-fearing Roman Catholic. He swept his arm around the company inclusively. We're going to make a retreat together and confess our sins, and God knows we want it badly. I don't mind, said Mr. Kiernan, smiling a little nervously. Mrs. Kiernan thought it would be wiser to conceal her satisfaction, so she said, I pity the poor priest that has to listen to your tale. Mr. Kiernan's expression changed. He doesn't like it, he said bluntly. He can do the other thing. I'll just tell him my little tale of woe. I'm not such a bad fellow. Mr. Cunningham intervened promptly. We'll all renounce the devil, he said, together, not forgetting his works and pomps. Get behind me, Satan, said Mr. Fogarty, laughing and looking at the others. Mr. Power said nothing. He felt completely outgeneraled, but a pleased expression flickered across his face. All we have to do, said Mr. Cunningham, is to stand up with lighted candles in our hands and renew our baptismal vows. Oh, don't forget the candle, Tom, said Mr. McCoy, whatever you do. What? Said Mr. Kiernan. Must I have a candle? Oh, yes, said Mr. Cunningham. No, damn it all, said Mr. Kiernan sensibly. I draw the line there. I'll do the job right enough. I'll do the retreat business and confession and all that business. But no candles. No, damn it all, I bar the candles. He shook his head with farcical gravity. Listen to that, said his wife. I bar the candles, said Mr. Kiernan, conscious of having created an effect on his audience, and continuing to shake his head to and fro. I bar the magic lantern business. Everyone laughed heartily. That's a ninth Catholic for you, said his wife. No candles, repeated Mr. Kiernan obdurately. That's off. Bill?
The transept of the Jesuit church in Gardner Street was almost full, and still, at every moment, gentlemen entered from the side door and, directed by the lay brother, walked on tiptoe along the aisles until they found seating accommodation. The gentlemen were all well dressed and orderly. The light of the lamps of the church fell upon an assembly of black clothes and white collars. relieved here and there by tweeds, on dark mottled pillars of green marble and on lugubrious canvases. The gentlemen sat on the benches, having hitched their trousers slightly above their knees and laid their hats in security. They sat well back and gazed formally at the distant speck of red light which was suspended before the high altar. In one of the benches near the pulpit sat Mr. Cunningham and Mr. Kiernan. In the bench behind sat Mr. McCoy alone, and in the bench behind him sat Mr. Power and Mr. Fogarty. Mr. McCoy had tried unsuccessfully to find a place on the bench with the others, and when the party had settled down in the form of a quincunx, he had tried unsuccessfully to make comic remarks. As these had not been well received, he had desisted. Even he was sensible of the decorous atmosphere, and even he began to respond to the religious stimulus. In a whisper, Mr. Cunningham drew Mr. Kiernan's attention to Mr. Harford, the moneylender, who sat some distance off, and to Mr. Fanning, the registration agent and maker of the city, who was sitting immediately under the pulpit beside one of the newly elected councillors of the ward. To the right sat old Michael Grimes, the owner of 3 pawnbroker shops, and Dan Hogan's nephew, who was up for the job in the town clerk's office. Farther in front sat Mr. Hendrick, the chief reporter of the Freeman's Journal, and poor O'Carroll, an old friend of Mr. Kiernan's, who had been at one time a considerable commercial figure. Gradually, as he recognized familiar faces, Mr. Kiernan began to feel more at home. His hat, which had been rehabilitated by his wife, rested upon his knees. Once or twice he pulled down his cuffs with one hand, while he held the brim of his hat lightly but firmly with the other hand. Next.
Powerful-looking figure, the upper part of which was draped with a white surplice, was observed to be struggling up into the pulpit. Simultaneously, the congregation, unsettled, produced handkerchiefs and knelt upon them with care. Mr. Kernan followed the general example. The priest figure now stood upright in the pulpit, 2/3 of its bulk crowned by a massive red face appearing above the balustrade. Father Purdon knelt down, turned towards the red speck of light, and covered his face with his hands, and covering his face with his hands, prayed. After an interval, he uncovered his face and rose. The congregation rose also and settled again on its benches. Mr. Kernan restored his hat to its original position on his knee and presented an attentive face to the preacher. The preacher turned back each wide sleeve of his surplice with an elaborate large gesture and slowly surveyed the array of faces. Then he said, "For the children of this world are wiser in their generation than the children of light. Wherefore make unto yourselves friends out of the mammon of iniquity, so that when you die they may receive you into everlasting dwellings." Next, please.
Father Purdon developed the text with resonant assurance. It was one of the most difficult texts in all the scriptures, he said, to interpret properly. It was a text which might seem to the casual observer at variance with the lofty morality elsewhere preached by Jesus Christ. But he told his hearers the text had seemed to him specially adapted for the guidance of those whose lot it was to lead the life of the world, and who yet wished to lead that life not in the manner of worldlings. It was a text for businessmen and professional men. Jesus Christ, with his divine understanding of every cranny of our human nature, understood that all men were not called to the religious life, that by far the vast majority were forced to live in the world and, to a certain extent, for the world. And in this sentence, he designed to give them a word of counsel, setting before them as exemplars in the religious life those very worshippers of Mammon who were all men of the least men the least who were of all men the least solicitous in matters religious. Joe.
He told his hearers that he was there that evening for no terrifying, no extravagant purpose, but as a man of the world speaking to his fellow men. He came to speak to businessmen, and he would speak to them in a businesslike way. If he might use the metaphor, he said he was their spiritual accountant, and he wished each and every one of his hearers to open his books, the books of his spiritual life, and see if they tallied accurately with conscience. Tom.
Jesus Christ was not a hard taskmaster. He understood our little failings, understood the weakness of our poor fallen nature, understood the temptations of this life. We all had from time to time our temptations. We all had our failings. But one thing only, he said, he would ask of his hearers, and that was to be straight and manly with God. If their accounts tallied in every point, to say, well, I have verified my accounts, I find all well. But if, as might happen, there were some discrepancies, to admit the truth, to be frank, and say like a man, well, I have looked into my accounts. I find this wrong and this wrong, but with God's grace, I will rectify this and this. I will set right my accounts. Yeah. So,
not the sort of sermon that we would have heard if the catechins were roaring down from the altar. This seems to be a more kind and loving God who's hearing in this sermon. So
Well,
no fire and brimstone here.
This is a businessman's God.
Yeah. And adult men, I might add, instead of kind of children.
Yeah.
Great cash register in the sky.
That's exactly it. Right.
You'll get a
Oh yeah,
square deal
get
up
your
there.
set of indulgences.
It's very, very funny. The Kiernan being a Protestant originally, being so hung up on the trappings of the Roman Catholic Church, the candles. And he goes to such. All right, I'll go along with everything, but no bloody candles. You know.
Yeah.
Well, do you think at that particular point that he realizes maybe unconsciously that he is being manipulated, and so he needs to assert himself?
I don't think he ever understands that he's being manipulated. I really don't. I don't think he's capable of that understanding. But I could be wrong. I mean, that's just my interpretation. I just think it's just a deep-seated feeling he has about the church and its excesses in terms of its concern for appearance rather than substance. I mean, that's the real Protestant. The whole Protestant Reformation was all about that. You know, that's why there are no paintings. I mean, Protestant churches are generally very bleak and severe, just white walls and a single cross, no crucifixion, just a cross.
So help me out. At which part of the story do we learn that that Kiernan was originally a Protestant?
Very early.
Very early, and so he became a Catholic because he
when he got married.
Similar to Bloom.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities.
Bloom went the other way.
Similarities.
A lot of similarities to Bloom.
Yes.
in terms of his various occupations, very many things.
Mhm.
Yes.
So
It's a
the-
great story if you want to get to know the characters that will turn up again in Ulysses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Because each of them gets a little CV.
Yeah.
So when we do see them in Ulysses, they're at a different stage of their development, and they're not exactly the same as they are here, but that's the author's prerogative to take characters and renew them. I mean, to me, that's the whole point of Ulysses, is that the author's method of using people in real life, people in fiction, and his own characters in various configurations.
Mhm.
One thing,
And Mrs. Kiernan,
yeah,
they got married in Star of the Sea Church in Sandymount.
Sandymount,
And then they end up living in Glasnevin. So that's probably part of the downward spiral, is it? That they mention afterwards. Mr. Power is on his way up and Mr. Kiernan is on his way down. They mentioned that somewhere.
Yeah.
Mr. Power
Yes,
is younger than
yes.
him, and he is on his way. A younger man, yeah. And Mr. Kiernan's decline was mitigated by the fact that certain of those friends who had known him at his highest point of success still esteemed him, Mr. Power being one.
Even so, I would expect, I mean, they've been married 25 years. I wouldn't think that Kiernan's much more than 50. If he is, he might be in his late 40s. And that would make me maybe Mr. Powers in his 30s. I don't know. McCoy is an interesting character, who's much more developed, I think, in Ulysses than he is here, but we get some elements of his character already in this
We had the
story.
valise thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Still looking
Yeah.
He's already in the business of conning people out of their luggage.
right.
Yeah, I think he's just starting that.
Duncan, I put the lines, the reference you were looking for in the chat.
Okay, thank you. God, that whole doctrine conversation there where they're in the room and they've introduced the idea of going on this retreat, and then Fogarty shows up, and then they get into this whole, they're drinking whiskey and they have this whole esoteric conversation about doctrine. It's
Yeah.
just really, how do I put it? It really put me in a fog.
Well, actually, that you're in good company because they're kind of in a fog too because they get a lot of their facts wrong.
Yeah.
For instance, they talk about the Jesuits never being reformed. Oh, yeah, it's true. But as a guy who is Jesuit educated, I know they were suppressed in 1772. So, I mean, we just start there. And then there's a cascade of errors in terms of who they're attributing the resistance of papal infallibility to and so forth. So it actually becomes quite humorous when when you do a little background digging.
Yeah.
And you come from a deep Catholic background education, like some of us do.
Yeah, that's right.
There's no fun. It's very clear what's going on. So,
Yeah.
but I don't wish that big education on anybody.
Yeah.
Well, we seem to have survived.
What Joyce is reacting to. I missed that.
They don't seem to have any grasp of the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism.
Absolutely.
It's just one big blur to them.
Just the Pope.
Emphasis.
That's right.
Right. And the Pope and the Mother of God, those two things.
Yeah, that's it. It's like,
and it's very interesting. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I love the row about ex cathedra and the big fight at the content. I don't know whether that's true or not.
No, it's not. Actually, that's one of the facts that they get wrong in terms of who it was who was resisting and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very interesting that all of these discussions of faith and all of these, and even Mrs. Kiernan, who had a really strong belief in the Sacred Heart,
yes.
these were all very contemporary developments in Catholicism.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
the doctrine of papal infallibility was not around till about 1870, I think, is when it first.
Yeah.
Though there, afterwards, most of the church leaders argue that, well, it was implied from the beginning. But there were popes that made all kinds of heretical rulings over in terms of history. So infallibility, but to speak ex cathedra was the key. I mean, the Pope's not infallible if he says, well, the Mayo is going to win the cup this year. But when he's speaking ex cathedra and saying that, this part of church doctrine is real, that's a whole other story.
Only that.
And,
All matters of church doctrine.
Yeah.
I think when Joyce was in Rome, he looked up. He says somewhere he was looking up all this stuff while he was in Rome, But I think he was having great fun with it, and distributing it between the speakers, lux upon lux and crux upon crux,
right.
And upon is an English word in the middle of it, and it just kind of that didn't seem to bother them at all.
Right.
Martin Cunningham was very adamant about what he was saying, So I think Joyce was having great fun.
The Sacred Heart
didn't have much time to research this stuff when he was in Rome. His job was keeping him too busy.
Yeah.
My recollection is that when he was in Rome, he didn't write at all.
Yeah.
He had a sort of a day job, a sort of a 9-to-5 job. So it's very little time.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say that the wife's interest in the Sacred Heart runs through Dubliners. If you think of Evelyn, there's a picture of the Sacred Heart hanging on the wall. And there's a commentary written which interprets the story of Evelyn as the life story of, what's her name, Saint Mary Alacoque, I think is the name, of the person who had the vision of the Sacred Heart. And yet apparently you can read in Evelyn all the factors of that saint's life. So I read it, but I haven't studied it. It's kind of interesting that the Sacred Heart runs through Dubliners. I never realized that until quite recently. Here it is.
I think, Joe, the Sacred Heart runs through all of Ireland. There's not a country kitchen that you go into where you don't find
every home
with a red light in front of it.
Red light in our bedroom, yeah.
A picture of Eamon de Valera and one of John F. Kennedy.
Right.
And the Sacred Heart.
Those are the trio.
But you see, it's the little red lamp was the great key, because that was great for, I remember that was on my bedroom wall as a child. And your child wasn't afraid of the dark, but you could have the red lamp there and they sleep. So maybe it still survives.
Is that red light to represent the blood of Christ or something like that?
Well, you just had a red lamp under a picture of the Sacred Heart, but it was enough to reassure a child.
The red light was a sort of symbol that you would find in the church.
Yeah,
I think it's actually referred to here that he looked in the distance and saw the red light. Yeah. That was the presence of God being acknowledged.
Right.
And I think the red light in front of the Sacred Heart would be something similar.
Yeah.
In the houses I remember, it was a regular candle, but it would have been in a red glass holder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, that's right. So it'd glow red, but it wasn't like a red light bulb or anything like that. That would be
it's a little tiny light.
It would just be a little candle. What I can't remember what they're called now. Those little
the little metal surround.
Yeah. A votive candle, hence the term, right?
Candle, and you see, you have to remember there's very little light, no electrical power around outside the cities.
Right.
Number that I'm dialing, they said is not in service.
Oh, what did you say?
I'm going to walk over. Sorry.
I think Anne was having another conversation there.
Okay.
Mhm.
It
So I
sounded
have
like
this,
the Sacred
this
Heart for a
little,
moment speaking to us. I didn't know where it was from. But the marriage is pretty sour, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Well,
Back
you
in the
know,
hand, you, she says, I'd be frightened to come home.
He's a bit like Joyce's father, isn't he?
Yeah.
Where we have this
yeah,
situation. Is it in Ulysses where the daughter is trying to get some money to buy food?
Yeah, Dilly, for old Dilly.
Dilly, yeah.
Poor young Dilly.
And here we are again. This guy is not bringing home the money, so that when
Yeah.
he's out cold with
Mhm.
drink, she's going through his pockets to see what she can
Yeah.
find.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that the marriage is not great.
Yeah.
so let me ask Anne, Moser. Anne, did you deliberately request a meeting summary with AI companion? Okay, I don't hear her, so I'm going to assume she didn't. Okay.
Anne is gone, right?
oh, he's talking about Ann Meisner, who just appeared.
Oh, yeah, she's
Yeah,
been there
Ann
for a
Meisner
little
was
while.
there, and then I had a big notice that came up that said that Ann Meisner was requesting a meeting summary with AI something or another. And I just wanted to confirm, and I hadn't heard from her, so I assumed it was an accident.
I don't know. One of the interesting, very minor things that you just sort of gloss over is when Kiernan just mentions that the young man in the cycling outfit was a medical man. A medical, he identifies him as a medical student.
Mm.
So I wonder who that might be in Ulysses, which of the medical men were also cyclists. I know one of the brothers of one of the characters is racing on that day in Ulysses. But I can't remember now if it was one of the medical doctors or not.
Was
Could
that
be,
in the chapter?
It could be Gogarty because Cindy
Yeah,
Gogarty,
especially could have been Gogarty.
yeah, could be, yeah,
Yeah.
might not.
In this case, it would have been Mulligan, Buck Mulligan. But
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know.
A cycling suit, I presume, would not be a helmet and
It's not the lycra, the
hat.
the figure forming outfit that they wear today. It would have been it would have
Tweed.
been tight trousers, maybe with bicycle clips around the ankles or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they don't get caught in the spokes or in the chain. But they were.
Mm-hmm.
Though I guess in the posters for the bicycle races, they did wear some.
Yes,
That would be a race as opposed
around
right.
town. And
Yeah.
It's interesting because you forget that earlier generations had cycling suits,
Yeah.
Mm. So I think the discussion about the policeman is an interesting one, and for those who don't know it, my understanding is that actually police were recruited from the countryside. So it was kind of the technique that the English used all over the world, where they would always recruit their policemen from a different subculture to control the natives, so to speak. And it seemed like they would get these big, beefy guys out of the countryside to come in and deal with the Dublin citizenry.
Yeah.
Called the RIC, Duncan, the Royal Irish Constabulary.
Mm-hmm.
These guys did all sorts of jobs. They did the census. They were enumerators. They delivered summonses. And they wouldn't have been much loved, certainly in country communities.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's that funny little thing where they had the painting the picture of the policeman, and they had the cabbage thing, flinging cabbage at him. Is it 65? Which would have been the number of the policeman's badge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Catch your cabbage. It's
That's
very reminiscent of Bloom's musings too about
Yes.
the policemen off to their lunch. In when he's thinking about dinner, and he goes on and on about the policemen. One lot of them coming in, the other lot going out, and
Indian file.
yeah. I think he sort of characterizes them as the same way. They're kind of a loutish,
Mhm.
oafish, big galoots kind of a.
Yeah, they wouldn't write much poetry.
No, they wouldn't.
You know?
I seen that particular person the other night. One of them in Ulysses, he says, I mean, his grammar is even made to be very low class when he's quoted. Anyway,
Yeah, and you notice the policeman gets no information at all. Nobody cooperates with him.
Right.
He doesn't even get the name of the man he's going to
yeah.
see.
What's your name?
They don't offer any help at all.
But that's such a telling incident, that little detail. He gets out his book and licks his pencil,
Mhm.
gets ready to write, but
And
doesn't get anything.
doesn't get anywhere, and then repeats the questions of the cyclist.
Right.
That's a way of getting something to write, I presume.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's interesting what
So
you say, Duncan, about all over the world. One of my school friends had a relation who was an RIC man, a Royal Irish Constabulary, and he on independence he emigrated to Palestine and to join the RPC, the Royal Palestinian Constabulary. And because it was being run by the British, he said he had no difficulty. It was like walking into an Irish police station. He just walked in and started doing what he had been doing in Ireland.
Yeah, it was another British institution.
They just exported the format.
Yeah.
So,
everywhere.
Well, I think I told you an amusing part of my history where I was working at a institution for the mentally retarded, and one of the nurses there was an Irish woman who had the year before had left the convent in Ireland and migrated to the United States. And I'll just say she was making up for lost time. So she adopted me for a short period of time as her boyfriend, and then took me to visit her family, which were largely brothers who were Irish Boston policemen. And I was a skinny, long-haired ne'er-do-well. It was a very interesting visit.
Yeah.
But it did give me an image for the Royal Irish Constabulary,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
You were all very big people.
They would be.
Yeah, that's one of the dangers of a third date. You start to meet the brothers, you know. You want to be careful. Don't mess with our sister, you know.
One thing we haven't discussed at all yet is the title. And I think Joyce uses the word grace in all of its many meanings.
Yeah.
But what do you all think? What about this title, Grace?
If I'm correct, he only uses it once in the story, but it's implied all over the place in its different iterations.
Yeah, there's a good few with God's grace. I think it's at the very end. There's another God's grace.
Yeah.
God's grace.
By grace of these two articles of clothing, he said, a man could always pass muster.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's grace as sort of spiritual grace from God.
Yeah.
And there's grace in as you said, Donna, in terms of style or manners, which Cunningham, I suppose, would be an exemplar of.
Yeah, and it compares with Mr. Father, I should say, Purden, struggling up into the pulpit. He's somewhat obese, I would imagine.
Yes.
He's not a man who's fasting for Lent, I would say.
No.
And on the other hand, the cyclist is fit, and the cyclist would be perhaps the presence of Christ himself, ministering to the fallen man, as it were. And I think Father Purden, the red there always doesn't remind me of the Sacred Heart so much as the fires of hell burning around him, because this is a guy, you might remember, he got into trouble for saying this when it was on the course. This guy, everything's for sale. How big is your bucket? How much grace do you want? I'd say he's a price on everything.
Here's a note in my edition of the book that talks about this.
Yeah, all good.
And it's talking about original sin is a direct consequence of the fall of man, parodied by Mr. Kernan's fall into the Dantean hell of the lavatory of John Nolan's public house. Mr. Kernan's friend recognized how much he needs sanctifying grace, if only to retrieve the dignity he has lost, dignity being one of the things that he values most. He believes in the dignity of his calling and owes it to his dignity to show a stiff neck. On and on. Well, of course, in the very beginning of the story, not only does he fall down the stairs and he's in the lavatory, but he's face down. Apparently, this is a pretty disgusting lavatory he has managed to fall into, face down in the muck. I forget how they described it, but it was very graphic.
You'll still find some of those around the city.
Yeah, I'm imagining a lavatory I encountered in the countryside of Louisiana one night. It was pretty miserable.
Just adding to what you said, Duncan, I have a note on grace as well. It says, in Roman Catholic theology, grace is a supernatural gift freely given by God to rational creatures to enable them to obtain eternal life.
Yeah.
Grace, in less specific English usage, can refer to personal style and graciousness of manner, which I think we've touched on already. But it can also mean the period of grace granted to a debtor by a person who is owed money.
Yeah.
And that happens with Mr. Kernan.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when Fogarty comes in, right? There's this little note when Fogarty comes in with the bottle of whiskey. And that it was particularly appreciated since there was a matter of a debt that had not been settled for a few things.
They used to call that day, the name for that was Days of Grace. In settling a bill of exchange, there were, say, 5 days of grace. In other words,
that's right.
It's a legal term that you couldn't sue a guy within those 5 days. You had to wait for the 6th day.
It would be written into contracts as well now.
Days of grace.
Nowadays. Grace days.
Well, I think there's some relationship etymologically, linguistically, between grace and gratis, free, and the fact that grace is a free, is available from God through no effort of your own. It's entirely bestowed on, according to Catholic doctrine. It's not something you earn. It's not something you pay for. It's something that's just there for you to take advantage of.
Something called actual grace as well in the it's coming in somewhere. Yeah. There, but for the grace of God go I. Yeah.
Right.
And I think that there was some awkwardness, and when the guys came to recruit Mr. Kernan to go to the retreat with them, there was some gracefulness in the way they went about that.
Mm.
Although, well, they came in. They plotted this whole thing out with his wife. The wife was graceful enough not to get involved,
Yes.
but to
Yeah.
let the men handle this so he could, you know. I
No
thought,
harm could come of it, you know. So
Although
I
I
think
think
the
the
idea,
crossing swords with her husband in her presence.
yeah.
right.
Cunningham seems a bit more coy than McCoy, so
McCoy.
McCoy's sort of just catching up with it all. He's not really quite as hip to it as the rest of them are. It doesn't seem. The way that Cunningham just sort of talks around it and gets Kiernan interested in by various phrases and things, and then
Yeah.
it's pretty well thought out and planned. But what do we think comes of it? So, and that's the other interesting connection is we have the retreat at the Star of the Sea in the Gertie episode
Mm.
in Ulysses, and that's sort of what a similar thing that's going on. It's a retreat that's going on, and one wonders if Kiernan's in that building. But Cunningham earlier in the day doesn't mention anything about going to a retreat that night, so it's obvious. I don't think it's the same day or the same people, but it would have been a similar.
Yeah.
Except it's not Father Purdy though. It's Father what's his face?
Gardner? Or is that another one, Bill? Is it Father Gardner? I mean, I'll find
No,
out.
well, no, but the Father Purdy. They're at the church in Upper Gardner Street,
That's it.
which is right by Dorset Street. That's that beautiful Jesuit church there. And they have a Jesuit house there still.
Mhm. I would assume that these things happen pretty regularly, just based upon the amount of drinking, the amount of alcohol problems among the populace. I would assume that these sorts
Well,
of
that's kind of the other interesting thing. This is not a temperance meeting. This is not these are not pioneers that
Mhm.
they're trying to drag him into. It's just a retreat, and I think they're still drinking. I mean, they're drinking in his presence. They're having stout and they're
Yeah.
having whiskey. They're all sitting around drinking. So it's not
Yeah.
the alcohol that they're concerned with. It's just that they feel that Kiernan sort of needs a little boost again, that he's sort of maybe getting a little too off kilter. And
Yeah.
and so maybe and that in addition to the fact that he's a convert and not necessarily as strong in his faith. So I see in terms of his friends, them being pretty genuine in they're concerned for his immortal soul as well as his physical well-being. And I don't think that they really are that concerned about his drinking. He's just he was with the wrong company. He was with Harford, and he's sort of fallen in with a crowd that they might be able to wean him away from again.
Yeah. And like retreats were annual regular practice. I remember in here where I lived as a child, like you'd have in the summertime, usually in May, I think you'd have the men's retreat one week, followed by the women's retreat for their wives the next week.
Yeah.
And everyone went to them.
Yeah.
And not an unusual thing for them to do.
Sorry, Joe. There used to be retreats in Limerick, and I remember my old man used to go to it, and he'd bring a pal with them, and they'd drive down, but they'd get completely steamed before they went in. There was going to be a whole weekend of dryness and preaching, you know.
Right.
Yeah. Do you know Rathfarnham Castle, Donna? Do you? You would
I
know.
do, yes.
You know,
Yeah.
I can't remember that. Like that was a Jesuit retreat house.
Oh, right.
Uncles
Okay.
used to go to there every year, you know, sort of thing. But there was a famous case of a well-known company. I won't mention a name while we're being recorded, but a well-known business in Dublin had a very strong character, a company secretary there for years. And as a result of a weekend there, he was persuaded to go to the directors and tell them that he had been taking money for many years, a very large sum of money. And it was a very large business in Dublin. And I often wonder, by Monday evening time, did he regret having agreed with the Jesuits to shoot that? But there's a major fraud exposed by the good old Jesuits, you know?
Yeah. Called conscience.
Oh yeah, called conscience, called eternal life.
Yeah.
Gifford throws a doubt on the old Dante connection, you know. Everyone's probably got Gifford. You read the note, you know, the Stanislaus Joyce remarks that Grace has a, quote, obvious touch of parody of the Divine Comedy. And he goes on to say, the touch may be there in Kiernan's fall down the lavatory stairs in the first part of the story, Inferno, in Kiernan's convalescent second part, Purgatorio, and his achievement of the beatific vision of the third part, the distant red speck of light, Paradiso. But the parody, while demonstrable, seems to stop there and to remain an in-joke between brothers, rather than a pervasively informative presence in the story.
Didn't this happen to his father? Didn't he go on the retreat? And Stanislaus talks about how he followed them on the Friday or the Saturday and watched him go up and fumble around with the candles and so forth and all this. And he says somewhere else in his diary that he came home fairly drunk each night after the retreat. But anyway, he went to confession, I think, on the Sunday or something. But he came home mildly drunk, he said. And then he said that the priest had told him he wasn't a bad fellow after all, you know. And this was his big boast. Yeah. This was his big boast after the whole retreat. Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, I must look forward to reading the Brother's Keeper again.
Yeah.
Bill, in the chat, is that the reference that you were looking for in terms of who were the priests in the Nausicaa chapter?
Father Conroy.
Yeah, Father Conroy, right, which is Gabriel's brother. Who in Gabriel talks about him being a curate in
Balbriggan,
right? But here then in Ulysses, he's an assisting priest at the retreat at St. Mary's of the Sea. Conroy. Yeah.
This is where I get confused. This story takes place after Ulysses, right? Or when was it? I mean, it doesn't matter when it's written and when it actually takes place. Has Ulysses already happened?
No, that's later. But,
Ulysses is later than this.
Ulysses in 22, and this is Dubliners is put
no,
out.
but I think Katrina's talking about the year. Ulysses is set in 1904.
Right.
And does this story precede 1904 or is it after? And it's hard to know.
Narrative time.
Yeah.
What was that?
In terms of narrative time, I think is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so can I just kind of piggyback on your question and say, well, I've got the same one. Are there any sort of indications in either the story or Ulysses about the chronology of Grace and Ulysses? I mean, is it wide open? Could it happen chronologically, narrative time before or after, or what do we do? I like your question. Thank you. I was wondering the same.
Well, in both stories, McCoy is the assistant coroner. So I mean, and he had been all these other things,
right?
And now he's the assistant coroner. And so that is sort of contemporary.
Okay.
There's an appendix in my edition which gives the timeline for the completion of each story. And in relation to Grace, it said it was substantially completed by December 1905.
Yeah, but the question is, when is it set?
Yes.
There's a letter that Joyce says the story was set in 1901 or 1902.
Right.
But he could have been wrong. I remember reading somewhere else that there's something in the story which would put it slightly later, but it was definitely before 1904 anyway. It's according to Joyce, it was 1901 or 1902.
I would trust that. I would trust Joyce there. I mean, if that's what he said, because the fact that something in the story is chronologically incorrect is meaningless, because there are things in Ulysses that are chronologically incorrect. Joyce uses them.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of people, just agreeing with Bill's point, say that the Dead is based in 1904, or that kind of time. But when you get into it, it's probably based in 1889 or 1892, I think it is, but it's much earlier, and that will mean that the papal infallibility thing hasn't been issued, or not the infallibility, the women out of the choirs hasn't been issued, because that's November 1903, and that's why people home in on the Dead being in 1904, because the women out of the choirs. But that's completely, that's not the case. It's a fictitious date for within the Dead, and they say that that's why Conroy is put into Ulysses, to show to answer the question, what happens the next morning with Gabriel and Greta? Like, is that the end of the marriage sort of thing? And 12 years later, in 1904, they're still together. So, that's why Conroy appears. Gabriel Conroy is mentioned, and Greta is mentioned.
Can you remind me which chapter, please?
Yeah.
So, well, someone with a better head than mine might. Well, we have Gertie McDowell. Sorry, Bill. Gertie McDowell's episode is for Father Conroy, and then Bloom somewhere remembers, her Molly asking what was Greta wearing. I think might be in Wandering Rockets, but not sure.
Yeah, and I think Molly also talks about Greta as well. So
yeah.
But I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Ulysses, there's a reference to Julia Morgan having died.
That's it. You see, that is the whole point.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But even so,
yeah.
Gabriel is thinking she's going to die any time now.
Yeah, well, that means
she might have. So if this is Christmas 1904, or this is this is January 6, 1904. Julia Morgan could have died in February of 1904, and it would still be.
Yeah. But then the commentators dig into Portrait of the Artist, where the Conroy, the sisters, are depicted again under a different name, and working out the age of Stephen. You can sort of work it back to 1892 again. I mean, all these things, like, we're talking fiction.
Right.
Right.
There's
rabbit holes again.
Well, these are the puzzles. These are the puzzles that Joyce referred to.
Just to add, like last week, we had remember Kathleen Lynch, we had Molly referring to her in her soliloquy. Kathleen Mooney and her squealers.
Right,
but she also mentions this incident. Tom Kiernan falls down the stairs. Yeah. She said that drunken little barrel-lead man that fell down the stairs and bit a bit of his tongue off. She mentions that in her soliloquy as well. So Joyce was drawing all these threads together all the time. you know, and kind of looking back over what he'd written and drawing in the kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be very easy to end up in a place with high walls and bars, you know, if you spend time trying to draw diagrams of this stuff.
Yeah, reading Finnegan's Wake.
Yeah.
Or, you know, there could be
Bloom in the next cell.
with a little bit of alcohol, there could be wigs on the green. No, there was 1904. No, it was 1892.
That's it. I just saw a fight in the Lincoln Inn one Sunday night by some of the people who are visiting Swedish about whether Leopold Bloom has a mustache or not. No, it came to blows.
I believe it.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Well, I think the drink was taken, though.
Oh, it was only the drink talking, sir, again, you know. But anyway, it's part of the fun too. But as Donna says, like rabbit holes are always, you know, you're
always available.
must proceed with great caution down a rabbit hole. Must say I really learned from this reading of Dubliners. I always knew there was more in Dubliners than I was seeing. And it's been really great reading, run through it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
It bears rereading. And again, it will bear another go through many times.
Yeah, I suspect at some time in much later in the year or the early part of next year, we'll go through another round of Dubliners.
And we find new stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, this is just getting me started, actually. It's been very good for me.
Yeah.
Just before we go, in the chat, I think I found the reference people were talking to in Ulysses about Conroy, and it's in the Calypso chapter. I don't know. You can take a look if you want.
Okay. Well, okay. So go to the other chat. Can picture the whole scene in the church, stained glass windows.
No, one down from that.
Might manage a sketch by Mr. and Mrs. L.
And Gabriel is in chapter 7, apparently, which I can check as well. He's mentioned.
It's interesting that, I mean, Joyce creates this world, Dublin. It's a fictitious world, but it's based on a reality. It's based. I mean, this is the way, at least his experience of Dublin was very real. But it's a fictitious world. And then when he writes Ulysses, he introduces a new character, Bloom, who knows everybody in this previous world and all who know him. But you could a young author today could write a whole other book where there's a new character and he knows Bloom and he knows Cunningham and he knows Simon and he knows all these other people too. But it's a well-populated world, and
it's amazing that it is so attractive to people as a reading subject. We go back and back and back to it again and again and again, and it seems to reflect my life. You know, it seems like the sort of little things come up that they say, I worried about that once, and this sort of thing. And everyone seems to find it is written about them a little bit,
Yeah.
And that's why I like, someone coming along trying to redo it, say, I'm going to write such a thing about Boston and all. Well, it's impossible. Like, couldn't.
No.
I think it's a multidimensionality of the whole thing. And it's all these, it's like, when we're talking about the Conroys and how they appear here and they appear there and all that. And a little bit like, in Wandering Rocks, that one of the things about Wandering Rocks is because all these things are kind of happening in the same general time space, and they have all these different connections to it. And I think that makes it real to us. I mean, it's certainly in some senses, it's as real to us as our own lives.
Yes. Yeah.
Because we're led in all these different directions, whereas many times in our own lives we're so busy getting through the day and the year and all that, that we don't even make as many connections as are in something like Joyce's works. At least that's how it seems to me. It's very full and has wonderful dimensionality to it.
Yeah, they become like real people. Like there's when I first was reading this, the sense that everybody knows when Leopold Bloom was born. You know, that so you don't know that about many people that you read about. I mean, we know them; they're real people.
There's a plaque on the house where Leopold Bloom lived. I beg pardon, where he was born.
Right.
Know, where he lived as a schoolboy.
Yeah.
And there's a plaque up now. When you read it, it doesn't present him as a real character, but it's amazing. Like I go there with people who want to take the photograph of it. You know, sort of my friends from overseas, and it's quite amazing. And it's inch perfect mathematically the way it's done. It would be Kelly's Corner, Tom. Grandparents lived here. The real grandparents lived here. Joyce's father took an apartment there, and opposite those two houses is Bloom and what's the other character called? Goulding. You know, another fictitious character. So you've four corners of the road. You have the real houses and two fictitious houses. In the corner, and you find Bloomfield Terrace or Bloomfield Road. It's like you've stepped into Ulysses.
Or down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
The other thing is about talking about the Bloom's and so forth, that Joyce's father was born in 1849. Bloom was born in 1866, and James Joyce was born in 1882. So he has Bloom almost exactly between his father's birth and his own. You know, it's very close, about 16 years each side, or 16 and a half. Yeah. Whether that has any relevance or not, I do not know, but it's interesting.
Excellent.
You know, to the earlier point about how these stories speak to us still, I think what gets me, what appeals to me so much is that not only do the stories in Dubliners speak to us across the decades, but they speak to us across the generations, because they were written. I'm looking at the group and I'm saying that we're a pretty well seasoned bunch here. To us across the generations too, because Joyce was quite a young man when he wrote them, and here we are having very, very fruitful discussions at a much different stage of life that Joyce was when he wrote them.
Yeah.
I would think on that point, Dave, that we need to be at this advanced stage in our lives to be able to discuss them coherently.
Perhaps, or to have the leisure to do so.
Well, I think I may have said it in this group before. I remember Ulysses was on my English course in college back in the early 70s. And I did read it, but it meant absolutely nothing to me. And I had no guidance through it either, you know.
I left school in 1965, you know, high school, and I never heard the name James Joyce.
Wow.
And I came out with honors English, you know, in my school exam. You know, he wasn't, not only was he not taught, he wasn't mentioned. And it all took off. It all took off
amazing.
In 67, you see.
Mm-hmm.
It began to take off during President Kennedy's visit. When was that? In 63, wasn't it?
Yeah.
three, and like President Kennedy quoted from, well, alluded to, the bowl of bitter tears, quote from Telemachus, episode 1, and he all of a sudden, all the politicians that were, oh, I want to have dirty books in Ireland, they were all applauding him. You see, so within a few years, the tower was being, they were running up the flag on the tower, and that, which is in a state of collapse. And but even in up to 1982, there were no toilet facilities in the tower.
Right.
People who worked there had to look after it themselves. 1982, you think about it. So, like a guy who left school in 1965, sort of.
No, Joel, actually, that's an interesting point, because we have another Ulysses group from out of Montreal in Canada that I'm part of. I had the Irish ambassador on, the Irish ambassador to Canada on. He's a big Joyce fan, and he talked about how early days it was England and the U.S. which were the big fans of Ulysses, and Joyce was like a prophet without honor in his own land, because my understanding is Seven Eccles is gone. All that's left is a door that somebody salvaged. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Disgraceful, that, because when it began to take off, the Dublin Corporation fast-tracked the demolition because they wanted the hospital expanded.
Yeah.
They said, "Oh, well, this is taken. This is madness. It's taken hold. We better get rid of it." And
but here we are in 2024, and we can't save Usher's Island, and we can't save Barney Kiernan's, and we
Usher's Island has been lost. And
you'd think the Dublin Corporation would have gotten hip to the fact that this is great for tourism, and
not their strong suit, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But the door that Dave mentions there has been retained in the James Joyce Centre, so you can see number 7 Eccles Street. Yeah.
The Fritz Sen from Zurich, he tried to remove the number plate, the number 7, with a screwdriver back in the day, just before the demolition, at least to save the number plate. But he failed. He wasn't able to do it, he said. And then someone took the door off the skip and brought it down to what pub was it? In the off Grafton Street, and there's rested now. It's in the Joyce Centre. But the number plate has disappeared off Usher's Island. It wasn't me. And saved the number plate. Probably or done it.
Well, I'm going to mention John McCourt's latest book once again, Consuming Joyce.
Yes,
which is really worth reading.
We read that before you came in, Joe, I think.
Yeah, this is
very interesting.
Oh, he's great. Yeah, the whole Trieste thing is Evan Fritz. They started that up, and all the Joyce heads in Dublin decamped to Trieste after Bloomsday.
Still doing it.
Still doing it. Yeah, the scholarship applications are available now if you want to go there for the summer school.
Go, Katrina, off you go.
Well, we are 1 minute after the hour, and I think we'll close the party while we're still having fun.
Let me just ask you, Dublin. You have plans for the eclipse?
Oh yeah.
You're in the same. We get the eclipse out a little bit before you. It comes right through northern Ohio, and then it ends up going through Austin eventually, and down to the Gulf. Are you going to watch the eclipse while you're down there?
Wonder if he can't hear you. Is he frozen?
Looks like he's frozen.
Who is he talking to?
I'm talking to you.
You.
To me? Oh yeah, the eclipse is right. It's going to come right through my backyard.
Yeah, same here. It's going to come right through my backyard.
Yeah, yeah, and I will probably my original idea was the family was going to come, the grandchildren and all that, but there's a little concern because the counties are talking about emergencies, and my daughter arranged to leave by airplane that evening.
Hmm.
So um, they'll probably be in Austin to watch it,
Mm.
and I'll probably be out in the countryside, and
Ugh.
I'll walk out and take a look at it,
Yeah.
you know.
Duncan, can I just interject before we go as well in relation to next week? I
Mhm.
presume we'll be moving on to Dylan Thomas and Under Milkwood.
Yes.
And I just wanted to mention, and I'll send you a link, that over the weekend I managed to find on YouTube 3 episodes. I mean, it's not written episodically, but three,
Okay.
if you like, episodes of Under Milkwood with Dylan Thomas in the lead role, and
Oh,
it's actually hilarious.
okay. Now, did you send that to me by email just now or what?
No,
'Cause
I haven't done anything with it yet. I need to track down the actual link, and I'll send it to you by email then, if that's
okay.
okay.
All right. And then I'll post it.
If
I'll
you wouldn't
post it
mind posting it. Yep.
on the Monday readers and
Yep.
have it ready for anybody who wants it later. Great. That's great. Yes, that's what we're doing. So thanks everybody.
Thanks, Duncan.
What a great
Thank
group.
you. Bye.